The Olympics. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations said China's choice of a Uyghur athlete to participate in the Beijing Olympic torch-lighting ceremony was an attempt to divert world attention from human rights abuses. She urged that, despite the Olympics, the human rights situation in China be kept under review. Global warming is a threat to winter sports, American skier Gus Schumacher said. I think climate change will have the biggest impact on our sport in the coming years. A lot of things are changing in the sport of skiing, but this is something that will make it impossible, said the 21-year-old Alaskan athlete. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will travel to countries in the Pacific this week. The visit by the head of U.S. diplomacy aims to reaffirm Washington's strategic long-term focus on the Asia-Pacific region, despite the escalating crisis with Russia over Ukraine. Individuals found guilty of disorderly conduct aboard passenger airliners should be placed on a list of those who will not be allowed to fly, Delta Airlines told the U.S. Department of Justice. Head of European Commission talks with U.S. on gas supplies. Head of European Commission von Leyen, EU is in talks with the U.S. and others on gas supplies. Russian Gazprom is not interested in increasing gas supplies to Europe. The European Union, EU, is in talks with the US and other countries. The head of the European Commission, EC, Ursula von der Leyen said on Monday, February 7, reports Reuters. There are increasing signs that the Kremlin continues to use gas deliveries as a means of exerting political pressure, she said. At the same time, according to von der Leyen, the EU is in talks with the US and other countries to increase gas supplies to Europe. According to the head of the EC, Europe is building partnership with the US for energy security. First of all, it concerns increasing of LNG supplies, von der Leyen said. The day before, the head of diplomacy of the European Union Josep Borrell stated that Russia has been strictly fulfilling its contract obligations on gas supplies. However, according to him, the country refused to supply additional gas to fill up European storage facilities. On February 4, White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki said that the US and Europe, along with major fuel suppliers, are thinking about diversifying gas supplies to replace the Russian one. According to her, the US, in contact with its European allies, is looking for ways to implement such plans. On January 24, The Times, citing sources in the British Cabinet of Ministers, reported the fear of the authorities over the reduction of gas supplies to Europe in case of tough sanctions against Russia. On the same day, the press secretary of the Russian president, Dmitry Peskov, said that the fears of the British authorities were fake hysteria. The United States and a number of European countries have recently expressed concern about Russia's allegedly intensified aggressive actions against Ukraine. Moscow has repeatedly denied such accusations, saying that it does not threaten anyone, while such statements are used as a pretext to deploy as much NATO military equipment as possible near Russia's borders. On January 28, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russia was not going to start a war with Ukraine, while Western countries and the United States were hysterically developing the topic of Russia threatening Ukraine instead of forcing Ukraine to implement the Minsk agreements. The U.S. considers possible progress on the issue of Donbass autonomy. Blinken said that the U.S. considers possible progress on the issue of Donbass autonomy. The U.S. believes that Ukraine will be ready to move forward on the issue of the special status of Donbass if the proper order of implementation of the Minsk agreements is found. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said this on Monday, February 7. The agreements talk about special status for Donbass, and I believe that in the proper sequence the Ukrainians will be ready to move forward, he said in a briefing. According to Blinken, the U.S. and Ukraine agree on the perception of the Minsk agreements as a way to resolve the conflict in the East. The Secretary of State added that Kyiv is conscientious about implementing the agreements, which cannot be said about Russia. Earlier in the day, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said that the country would not engage in dialogue with certain areas of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. At the same time, he accused Russia of trying to destabilize the situation in the southeast of the country and drive a wedge between Kyiv and its Western partners. On January 31, the Secretary of the country's National Security and Defense Council NSDC, Alexei Danilov, noted that the implementation of the Minsk agreements would lead to the destruction of Ukraine. In response, Russian presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov pointed out that it was difficult to talk about any meetings at the highest level because of this position of Kiev. On February 1st, Russian permanent representative to the United Nations Vasily Nebenzia drew attention to the fact that the Minsk agreements should be implemented in their entire package, and not in parts, as Ukraine was trying to do. He regretted that the Ukrainian authorities had not made a single effort to implement the Minsk agreements. On January 26, the political advisors of the Normandy Quartet met at the Élysée Palace in Paris. Representatives of Russia, Germany, France and Ukraine held a meeting for more than 8.5 hours. The parties agreed on the need to maintain the ceasefire in Donbass regardless of differences on the Minsk agreements, as well as took stock of them. Since 2014, the Kiev authorities have conducted a military operation against the residents of Donbass, who refused to recognize the results of the coup d'état and the new government in Ukraine. At the same time, Kiev blames Moscow for the situation. Russia has repeatedly stated that it is not a party to the internal Ukrainian conflict. Its settlement is being discussed in the Minsk and Normandy formats. Exchange of doubts. Military expert Vladimir Kozin on what questions the US and NATO proposals on security guarantees raised. The Spanish newspaper El País published full texts of confidential US and NATO answers to Russian proposals on global security on February 2nd. The US State Department confirmed that the documents are authentic. Substantively, the two documents do not contradict each other, although the practical proposals put forward in them are detailed differently because of the specific range of unresolved issues of concern to Washington and NATO headquarters in Brussels, and because of the individual types of weapons they possess and control. Vladimir Putin has already spoken twice about the three significant shortcomings of the answers outlined. These are the reaffirmation by Washington and Brussels of the alliance's open-door policy, the continued deployment of shock weapons systems near Russia's borders, and the firm reluctance to return the bloc's combined military machine deployed and built up in Europe to its 1997 position, when the NATO-Russia Founding Act was signed. The overall negative key characteristics of the US-NATO responses should also include the following features. 1. They repeat the already well-known positions of the United States and the transatlantic alliance on politico-military issues in relations with Russia, which they have outlined in official oral and written statements for many years. 2. Their texts put forward a number of provisions in the politico-military sphere that are either unacceptable to the Russian side or simply not feasible due to the absence of a problem. Unacceptable is, for example, the idea of considering the non-deployment of American nuclear weapons only in the states of Eastern Europe, leaving them in the central part of the European continent, in Italy and Germany, or in the Western region, in Belgium and the Netherlands, as well as in Asia, i.e. in Turkey. The term non-strategic nuclear weapons used in the two Western messages to Russia is intended to remove from the agenda of future negotiations on this topic the US nuclear bombs that are mounted on their existing and new types of heavy strategic bombers. The joint position of Washington and Brussels that Crimea does not belong to the Russian Federation and that Russian troops must be withdrawn from there is unacceptable to Moscow. The US text of the response repeated without evidence the false figure about the presence of Russian troops near the borders with Ukraine, 100,000 people. Nor can we be satisfied with the US attempt to accuse Russia again of violations of the INF Treaty, from which they withdrew proactively and unilaterally under far-fetched pretexts, although they themselves had violated it 117 times in the 20 years before denunciation, when they used undestroyed medium-range missiles to test the effectiveness of the missile defense system. No one has so far documented Russia's violations. Also unacceptable is Washington's demand for a ban on the deployment of Iskander missiles on Russian territory in the absence of the INF Treaty, under whose provisions they would not be subject if it were retained in its previous form. Moscow is hardly satisfied with the initiative to exchange inspection groups with Russian representatives visiting U.S. missile defense facilities in Romania and Poland to check whether, as the Pentagon assured,